Chapter 38. The Miss Dashwoods had now been rather more than 2 months in town, and Marianne's impatience to be gone increased every day. She sighed for the air, the liberty, the quiet of the country, and fancied that if any place could give her ease, Barton must do it. Eleanor was hardly less anxious herself for their removal, and only so much less bent on its being effected immediately, as that she was conscious of the difficulties of so long a journey, which Marianne could not be brought to acknowledge. She began, however, seriously to turn her thoughts towards its accomplishment, and had already mentioned their wishes to their kind hostess, who resisted them with all the eloquence of her goodwill when a plan was suggested, which, though detaining them from home yet a few weeks longer, appeared to Eleanor altogether more eligible than any other. The Palmers were to remove to Cleveland about the end of March for the Easter holidays, and Mrs. Jennings with both her friends received very warm invitations from Charlotte to go with them. This would not in itself have been sufficient for the delicacy of Miss Dashwood, but it was enforced with so much real politeness by Mr. Palmer himself, as joined to the very great amendment of his manners towards them since her sister had been known to be unhappy, induced her to accept it with pleasure. When she told Marianne what she had done, however, her first reply was not very auspicious. "Cleveland!" she cried with great agitation. "No, I cannot go to Cleveland." "You forget," said Eleanor gently, "that its situation is not in the neighbourhood of—" "But it's Somersetshire. I cannot go into Somersetshire. There, where I looked forward to going. No, Eleanor, you cannot expect me to go there." Eleanor would not argue upon the propriety of overcoming such feelings. She only endeavoured to counteract them by working on others, and represented it, therefore, as a measure which could fix the time of her returning to that dear mother whom she much wished to see, in a more eligible, more comfortable manner than any other plan could do, and perhaps without any greater delay. From Cleveland it was within a few miles of Bristol. The distance to Barton was not beyond 1 day, though a long day's journey, and their mother's servant might easily come there to attend them down, and as there could be no occasion for their staying above a week at Cleveland, they might now be at home in little more than 3 weeks' time. As Marianne's affection for her mother was sincere, it must triumph with little difficulty over the imaginary evil she had started. Mrs. Jennings was so far from being weary of her guest that she pressed them very earnestly to return with her from Cleveland. Eleanor was grateful for the attention, but it could not alter their design, and their mother's concurrence of being readily gained, everything relative to their return was arranged as far as it could be, and Marianne found some relief in drawing up a statement for the hours that were yet to divide her from Barton. "Ah, Colonel, I do not know what you and I shall do without the Miss Dashwoods," was Mrs. Jennings' address to him when he first called on her, after their leaving her was settled. "For they are quite resolved upon going home with the Palmers. How forlorn we shall be when I come back! Lord, we shall sit and gape at one another as dull 2 cats. Perhaps Mrs. Jennings was in hopes, by this vigorous sketch of their future ennui, to provoke him to make that offer which might give him an escape from it, and if so, she had soon afterwards good reason to think her object gained, for, on Eleanor's moving to the window to take more expeditiously the dimensions of a print which she was going to copy for her friend, he followed her to it, with a look of particular meaning, and conversed with her for several minutes. The effect of this discourse on the lady, too, could not escape her observation, for though she was too honourable to listen, and had even changed her seat on purpose so that she might not hear, to one close by to the pianoforte on which Marianne was playing, she could not keep herself from seeing that Eleanor changed colour, attended with agitation, and was too intent on what he had said to pursue her employment. Still farther in confirmation of her hopes, in the interval of Marianne's turning from one lesson to another, some words of the Colonel's inevitably reached her ear, in which he seemed to be apologizing for the badness of his house. This set the matter beyond a doubt. She wondered indeed at his thinking it necessary to do so, but supposed it to be the proper etiquette. What Eleanor said in reply she could not distinguish, but judged from the motion of her lips, she did not think that any material objection, and Mrs. Jennings commended her in her heart for being so honest. They then talked on for a few minutes longer without her catching a syllable, and when another lucky stop in Marianne's performance brought her to these words in the Colonel's calm voice, "I am afraid it cannot take place very soon." Astonished and shocked at so unlover-like a speech, she was almost ready to cry out, "Lord, what should hinder it?" but checked her desire, confined herself to this silent ejaculation. "This is very strange. Sure, he need not wait to be older." This delay of the Colonel's side, however, did not seem to offend or mortify his fair companion in the least, for on their breaking up their conference soon afterwards, and moving different ways, Mrs. Jennings very plainly heard Eleanor say in a voice which showed her to feel what she said, "I shall always think of myself much obliged to you." Mrs. Jennings was delighted with her gratitude, and only wondered that after hearing such a sentence, the Colonel should be able to take leave of them, as he immediately did with the utmost sang-froid, and go without making her any reply. She had not thought her old friend could have made such an indifferent suitor. What had really passed between them was to this effect. "I have heard," he said with great compassion, "of the injustice your friend Mr. Ferris has suffered from his family. For if I understand the matter right, he has been entirely cast off by them for preserving his engagement with a very deserving young woman. Have I been rightly informed? Is it so?" Eleanor told him that it was. "The cruelty, the impolitic cruelty," he replied with great feeling, "of dividing or attempting to divide two young people long attached to each other is terrible. Mrs. Ferris does not know what she may be doing, what she may drive her son to. I have seen Mr. Ferris 2 or 3 times in Harley Street, and am much pleased with him. He is not a young man with whom one can be intimately acquainted in a short time, but I have seen enough of him to wish him well for his own sake, and as a friend of yours I wish it still more. I understand that he intends to take orders. Will you be so good as to tell him that the living of Delaford, now just vacant, I am informed by this day's post, is his, if he think it worth accepting. But that, perhaps, so unfortunately circumstanced as he is now, it may be nonsense to appear to doubt. I only wish it were more valuable. It is a rectory, but a small one. The late incumbent, I believe, did not make more than £200 per annum, and though it is certainly capable of improvement, I fear not to such an amount to afford him a very comfortable income. Such as it is, however, my pleasure in presenting it to him will be very great. Pray assure him of it." Eleanor's astonishment of this commission could hardly have been greater. Had the Colonel been really making her an offer of his hand? The preferment, which only 2 days before she had considered as hopeless for Edward, was already provided to enable him to marry, and she, of all people in the world, was fixed on to bestow it. Her emotion was such as Mrs. Jennings had attributed to a very different cause, but whatever minor feelings, less pure, less pleasing, might have had a share in that emotion, her esteem for the general benevolence and her gratitude for the particular friendship which together prompted Colonel Brandon to this act were strongly felt, and warmly expressed. She thanked him for it with all her heart, spoke of Edward's principles and disposition with that praise which she knew them to deserve, and promised to undertake the commission with pleasure, if it were really his to put off so agreeable an office to another. But at the same time she could not help thinking that no one could so well perform it as himself. It was an office, in short, from which, unwilling to give to Edward the pain of receiving an obligation from her, she would have been glad to be spared herself. But Colonel Brandon, on motives of equal delicacy, declined it likewise, seemed still so desirous of it being given through her means that she would not on any account make it further opposition. Edward, she believed, was still in town, and fortunately she had heard his address from Miss Steele. She could undertake, therefore, to inform him of it in course of the day. After this had been settled, Colonel Brandon began to talk of his own advantage in securing so respectable and agreeable a neighbour, and then it was that he mentioned with regret that the house was small and indifferent, an evil which Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings had supposed her to do, made very light of, and at least as far as regarded to its size. "The smallness of the house," she said, "I cannot imagine any inconvenience to them, for it will be in proportion to their family and income." By which the Colonel was surprised to find that she was considering their marriage as the certain consequence of the presentation, for he did not suppose it possible that Delaford living could supply such an income as anybody in this style of life would venture to settle on, and he said so. This little rectory can do no more than make Mr. Ferris comfortable as a bachelor. It cannot enable him to marry. I am sorry to say that my patronage ends with this, and my interest is hardly more extensive. If, however, by any unforeseen chance it should be in my power to serve him further, I must think very differently of him from what I do now, if I am not as ready to be useful for him then, as I sincerely wish I could be at present. What am I now doing indeed seems nothing at all, since I can advance him so little towards what must be his principal, his only object of happiness. His marriage must still be a distant good, and at least I am afraid it cannot take place very soon. Such was the sentence which, when misunderstood, so justly offended the delicate feelings of Mrs. Jennings. But after this narration of what really passed between the Colonel and Brandon and Eleanor, while they stood at the window, the gratitude expressed by the latter on their parting may perhaps appear in general not less reasonably excited, nor less properly worded, than if it had arisen from an offer of marriage.